Most people assume civil wars begin with a sudden spark, a coup, an assassination, or a violent uprising. But in reality, they almost always begin with something far less dramatic. In 2016, the United States quietly slipped out of the world's list of full democracies. Now, that's an interesting word, right? Full democracies. What exactly does that mean? Well, the downgrade didn't come from politicians or the media. It came from the Economist Intelligence Unit, which tracks the strength of political systems around the globe. Their data showed that America had joined the ranks of what they call a flawed democracy. Just think about that. A flawed democracy. At first glance, this might sound academic, just a change in the score. But history shows that this moment is often the first domino in a chain that leads to something far more dangerous. Because when a country falls into that in-between zone, not fully democratic, but not fully authoritarian, its institutions weaken, polarization hardens, and the rules that normally keep politics peaceful, well, they start to erode. And this is what always happens before a civil war. In this video, we'll trace that pattern across history, from Yugoslavia to Lebanon to America's own 1860s, and then ask the uncomfortable question. If the US is already following the script, how close are we to repeating the ending? And stick with me here, because by the end, you'll see why civil wars almost never look inevitable until it's already too late. The cracks in a nation's foundation often spread slowly and silently. Political scientists note that the US now meets two key criteria, commonly seen in countries on the brink of civil war. And that's pretty crazy. Two common criteria that are often seen right before a civil war starts. And to put this in perspective, just think of how 3, 5, 10, 20 years ago, how unlikely the thought of the US ending up in a civil war actually was. And understanding how these criteria and how they played out in other societies might help us recognize the danger before it's too late. One critical warning sign is a country's political system, sliding into a gray zone between democracy and autocracy. Political experts call this an anocracy. Most nations at the risk of civil war fall into this unstable middle ground. Power struggles in such states often aren't kept in check by strong institutions, and suddenly shifts in either direction, toward more democracy or more dictatorship, can be destabilizing. For example, Iraq in 2003 was a dictatorship that the US abruptly tried to turn into a democracy. Within months, the country spiraled into a brutal civil war. Conversely, a democracy that rapidly backslides into authoritarian practices can likewise trigger unrest. Ukraine, for instance, experienced violent upheavals when its democratic institutions were undermined a few years ago. The pattern here is very clear. When a government is in flux and institutions lose their credibility, extremist factions see an opening to push their agenda by force. For most of its history, the United States was considered a stable, full democracy. And not only a stable, full democracy, but the epitome of what a democracy should look like. But recent years have shaken that foundation. Starting in 2016, major democracy indices began downgrading the US political system, citing eroding norms and rising dysfunction. And to be clear here, the dysfunction wasn't on one side or the other. It was the fact that the two sides became divided. By early 2021, in the wake of a very much disputed election and an unprecedented riot in the Capitol, the United States was formally classified as an anocracy for the first time since the 18th century. This is not a label any American ever expected to see applied to their country. It places the US in the very category that research shows is most prone to internal violence. In other words, the structural guardrails that keep political competition peaceful have been weakening, putting America in the danger zone, where conflicts that once played out through ballots can start playing out with bullets. The second major warning sign is factionalism. When a society's politics stop being about policy debates and instead harden around ethnic, religious, or racial identity. And I'm going to add one more here, because right now, a lot of people's politics are becoming their identity. which in my mind is absolutely absurd. How is it possible that any one person can say I 100% align with the political beliefs of only two parties, giving them two options, and aligning completely with one side or the other? The ability for critical thinking seemingly has disappeared because it used to be that any common sense person wouldn't align themselves from an identity standpoint with a political party. They would have things that they agree with and things that they don't. And now it seems that the ability for anybody to critically think about who they are and what they actually believe in without associating it to red or blue has pretty much disappeared. In healthy democracies, political parties are coalitions of different groups united by common ideas or goals. They don't have to be the exact same goals. But before civil wars, those broad coalitions often fracture into identity-based factions, parties defined by who their members are rather than what they believe. When citizens organize politically around immutable traits like race or religion, every election starts to feel existential, a zero-sum clash of identities rather than a contest of ideas. This pattern has appeared across the world. In the former Yugoslavia, as communist rule weakened in the 1980s, politics increasingly fell along ethnic lines. Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, each following leaders who spoke of defending our people. By the early 1990s, that factionalism had primed the region for a horrific civil war once central authority completely collapsed. Even in democracies like Lebanon in the 1970s, parties became openly sectarian, Christian versus Muslim, and power sharing broke down amid mutual fear, leading to a 15-year civil war. The common thread is that when political identity aligns perfectly with ethnic or religious identity, compromise starts to look like betrayal. Every side fears that losing an election means their group's very survival or status is at stake. Is this all starting to sound familiar? And this is a mindset that makes violence seem like a regrettable necessity. And what's really scary here is that the United States has shown signs of this exact realignment. Americans in the mid-20th century saw plenty of Republicans in the Northeast and African Americans voting Republican, or conservative Democrats in the South. Politics cut across identities. Not anymore. Today, about 90% of one major party is white, while the other party's base is increasingly Black, Latino, and Asian American. Over the past several decades, especially following the Civil Rights era, the two parties have sorted almost entirely by race and culture. One side is seen, rightly or wrongly, as representing Christian, rural, and predominantly white America. The other, a more urban, multicultural America. This is factionalism 101. And I'm not saying any of this to try to lump certain people into certain parties. I'm talking about the actual fact of the matter. Politics is becoming a battle between identity groups. When such factional lines harden, people begin to view the opposing party not just as rivals with different policies, but as a threat towards their way of life. And that is exactly the sentiment that has historically paved the way to civil conflict. Perhaps the most surprising lesson researchers have learned is who often initiates civil strife. And it's not who you think. It's easy to assume that the most downtrodden, oppressed class will eventually explode in rebellion. But in case after case, the spark comes instead from groups that were once dominant but feel their power slipping. In other words, the old order striking back. Political scientist Barbara F. Walter notes that it's usually not the weakest faction that starts a civil war, and history bears this out. The American Civil War of 1861 was not launched by enslaved people rising up, but by the Southern planter elite, white landowners who had dominated the U.S. political scene since the nation's founding. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency on an anti-slavery platform, Southern leaders feared that their grip on power and their entire way of life, which was built on slavery, was about to vanish. Southern states seceded before Lincoln even took office. They explicitly declared that preserving white supremacy and slavery was their cause. And just keep in mind here for a second which party Abraham Lincoln was a part of. The South's former dominance in Congress and the economy was now threatened by changing demographics and values, so they chose to fight rather than relinquish power. Decades later in the former Yugoslavia, a similar dynamic unfolded. Under communist Yugoslavia, Serbs were the largest and politically dominant ethnic group. As the federation began to break apart around 1991, Serbian nationalists, fearing the loss of influence over regions like Croatia and Bosnia and Kosovo, were the first to mobilize militias and stockpile weapons. They portrayed the prospect of a multi-ethnic democracy as a mortal threat to Serb identity. One Serb leader, and I think I'm going to get this right, but Radovan Karadzic, went so far as to publicly compare Bosnian Muslims to animals, dehumanizing them to justify violence in the name of Serb survival. That dehumanizing rhetoric wasn't incidental. It's a hallmark of a society on the brink. When political leaders start calling their opponents or minority groups vermin, cockroaches, or animals, and I mean, it really lowers the psychological barriers to violence. It's no different than two people getting in a disagreement and throwing cuss words and calling each other names. With every name, the risk of the fight happening goes up. In fact, it's pretty much when any sort of disagreement becomes uncivilized that people get into fights. And here's the real problem. It's that people believe that striking first is a form of self-defense against an existential threat. So in other words, if you feel as if you could possibly die, the likelihood of you taking action before the other person can goes up. And unfortunately, it's no different in politics. In the United States, many people see echoes of this pattern. The faction most openly flirting with political violence is not the most marginalized or powerless, but segments of the historically dominant majority. And I'll let you determine for you which party you think that is, because really this conversation can be had about either party at this point. But as America's demographic shift and social norms change, a subset of this group perceives the change as a threat to the real America, rather than a natural evolution. They talk of being replaced or losing our country, and a small but vocal minority have begun to organize, arm themselves, and even hint at insurrection. This isn't mere conjecture either. In 2020, the FBI foiled a plot by a right-wing militia to kidnap a state governor, a plan driven by the conspirators' belief that they were defending their way of life. In online forums and rallies, you'll hear talk that echoes past grievances, that voting has failed and more extreme measures are justified. It's the playbook of the old order striking back, now unfolding in a modern economic democracy. Civil wars also tend to be preceded by the breakdown of institutions and norms that normally contain conflict. Before people pick up guns, they first lose faith in courts, legislatures, and elections as fair arbiters of disputes. As polarization deepens, each side begins to view those institutions as biased or illegitimate. At the same time, social norms against violence begin to erode. Neighbors stop seeing each other as fellow citizens and instead as enemies. In the lead up to past conflicts, moderates who used to bridge differences grow silent, completely drowned out or intimidated by hardliners. Public discourse coarsens and dehumanization becomes commonplace. Opponents are labeled traitors, infidels, vermin. This rhetorical shift is a red flag, because once a group is portrayed as less than human, violence against them starts to feel permissible. We can witness some of these troubling signs in the current American landscape. Trust in government is near historic lows. Only about 17% of Americans say they trust Washington to do what is right most of the time. Congress is mired in partisan gridlock, widely seen as completely dysfunctional. Even the Supreme Court's legitimacy is now questioned by many, viewed as just another political battleground. When the mechanisms of democracy seem rigged or broken, people begin to explore more radical alternatives. They listen to outside leaders who claim the system itself is the problem and promise to fix it by any means. In Weimar Germany's final days, for example, Hitler rose by convincing millions that the parliamentary system was hopeless. Only a strong hand, his, could save the nation. In our era, we see politicians pushing the boundaries of law and precedent, testing how far they can go without consequence. They pressure law enforcement and the military to take sides, signaling that loyalty to a leader or cause matters more than loyalty to the most important thing in the US, which is the Constitution. All of this eats away at the integrity of the institutions meant to mandate conflicts peacefully. As norms break down, political violence shifts from unthinkable to acceptable, to eventually routine. Scholars point out an especially perilous moment when partisan supporters move from being passive bystanders to active apologists for violence from their side. In America today, we've seen rhetorical justifications for violence creeping in, and even recently, the absolutely disgusting celebration of violence. After incidents of political aggression, whether it's clashes at protests, threats to officials, or even assassination plots, partisans often rush to explain them away or draw false equivalencies, rather than unanimously condemning the acts. And the question is, what world are we living in where really bad things happen and there isn't the unanimous condemning of these really bad things? I mean, just think about 9/11, a moment where the country united. Now we're seeing the complete opposite, where people are divided and they aren't coming together even when they should be. That normalization is what allows violence to escalate. Moderates and voices of conscience, even within the aggrieved factions, start to self-censor out of fear. When simply calling for civility gets you labeled a traitor by your own side, the extremists gain free rein. At that point, a society's immune system, its capacity to reject extremism, is severely weakened. Civil wars rarely burst forth fully formed. They usually lurch through stages of escalation. The CIA has a manual on insurgency that breaks it down into 3 phases, which serve as a grim roadmap. Phase 1 is the pre-insurgency, where the grievancy is building. A group with deep grievances against the government begins organizing and spreading its message. At this stage, the fight is mostly political. Angry rhetoric, rallies, recruitment, and perhaps stockpiling of weapons. Most people outside the movement hardly even notice that this is happening, or they don't take it seriously. In phase 2, the incipient insurgency, there's isolated incidents. The discontented groups start testing the waters of violence. You see isolated attacks or clashes, a bombing here, an armed protest there. These incidents might be dismissed as one-offs or the work of lone wolves, but they're actually probes. The group is gauging the state's response and trying to inspire copycats. If the government response is weak or society remains apathetic, these violent events become more frequent. And keep in mind, again, this is all from the CIA's insurgency playbook or guide or whatever it is. In phase 3, which is the open insurgency, the conflict is out in the open. A sustained campaign of attacks, not just against symbolic targets, but against the state and rival groups on a regular basis. At this point, you have something that can rightly be called a civil war or insurgency, a low-intensity war that might not have formal battle lines, but is nonetheless an organized and violent conflict. The United States is somewhere currently between phase 1 and phase 2 by most expert assessments. There are organized militant groups with grievances, phase 1, and we've seen scattered violent episodes, phase 2, for example. The 2017 Charlottesville attack, where an extremist drove into a crowd of protesters, or the pipe bombs mailed to political figures, or the foiled plots to kidnap officials, and other, of course, recent stuff that has happened that we won't name. The January 6, 2021 attack on the US Capitol was a flashing red light in this progression. On that day, a political grievance turned into a mob assault on the seat of government, something that inches into phase 3 territory of open insurgency. One counterinsurgency expert suggested that January 6 could have been the start of a true insurgency in America. Thankfully, it wasn't. Not yet. The swift response of the FBI and the prosecutions of those involved, which of course have now been overturned, sent a signal that such overt violence would not be tolerated. And this was a good thing. In the aftermath, the US pulled back from the brink a bit. Federal authorities reinforced that the rule of law still applies, and thus the country likely remains in the incipient stage rather than sliding into full-blown conflict. However, it's a fragile equilibrium. All it might take is a few more flashpoints handled poorly for the situation to deteriorate. Consider how these stages played out elsewhere. In the late 1960s and 1970s, the United States itself experienced a period of domestic upheaval that, in retrospect, looks like a contained insurgency. Hundreds of bombings and domestic terror attacks by extremist groups rocked the country. Nearly 1,500 terrorist incidents, nearly all domestic, occurred throughout the 1970s. Assassinations of major leaders, riots that required military deployment, and violent clashes were recurrent. Polls in 1968 showed 81% of Americans believed law and order had broken down. This era didn't escalate into a second civil war, but it inflicted deep scars. Many U.S. cities never fully recovered from the destruction of that period. The country pulled back from the precipice through a combination of political reforms, FBI action against extremist groups, and the exhaustion of the violence itself. But the lesson remains. Once a nation enters that incipient phase, it can sustain a low-level conflict for years, even decades, unless conscious efforts are made to reverse course. Concrete examples help illustrate how civil conflict sneaks up. Take Michigan in April 2020, amidst a heated debate over COVID-19 lockdowns. Armed protesters, some affiliated with militias, stormed the Michigan state capitol. They carried assault rifles, full-blown assault rifles, into the gallery of the legislature, angrily shouting down at lawmakers below. It was dramatic and unsettling, and by the way, most people forgot it even happened. The police, pretty much constrained by loose gun laws, simply stood by as militia members in tactical gear loomed over these elected officials that were engaged in debate, peaceful debate. And scenes like that are typical in the early chapters of a civil conflict, when extremist groups test how far they can go in intimidating the government. Many in America, from both sides of the aisle, were shocked by those images. But in a polarized environment, others applauded the show of force or downplayed it as a legitimate protest. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think showing up with a whole bunch of guns is a form of legitimate protest, unless maybe you're protesting gun laws. But otherwise, it doesn't really seem like it fits the bill for what is a legitimate protest. The following month, the FBI discovered a plot by some of those same militia actors to kidnap Michigan's governor. All of this happened in what most would still call peacetime. Such incidents show how a society can become gradually accustomed to intimidation and the threat of violence in politics. Around the same time, in 2020 and 2021, numerous other incidents hinted at spreading acceptance of violence. In the span of just 4 months, over 50 vehicular attacks were recorded across America, where drivers plowed into crowds of protesters. These weren't all coordinated, but they fed a sense of chaos. Meanwhile, on the streets of some cities, opposing protest groups, far right and far left, occasionally clashed with sticks, bear spray, and even sometimes gunfire. Each side could point to the other and say, "See, they're attacking and we must defend ourselves." This reciprocal fear is exactly how societies tip from sporadic unrest into a sustained spiral of violence. Yet, even as these flare-ups occur, life for most people still feels normal. That's one of the eeriest aspects of a pre-Civil War environment. Conflict bubbles at the fringes of society before it consumes the center. If you weren't in certain neighborhoods of Belfast in the early 1970s, you might not have realized how close Northern Ireland was to the abyss. In Yugoslavia's late 1980s, people still went to work, they still watched sports, and married across ethnic lines, until suddenly they just didn't. One day in Sarajevo, friends of different ethnicities were sharing coffee. A year later, they were literally shooting at each other from snipers' nests. A former resident of Sarajevo in 1992 recalled the disbelief as things unraveled, saying, "We expected tensions, maybe some violence, but not this. Not a multi-year siege with neighbors turned into mortal enemies." Civil wars always surprise the population that slides into them. The warning signs can seem abstract or alarmist, until, in hindsight, they become painfully clear. The trajectory towards conflict is not inevitable. Just as history provides examples of societies that fell into civil war, it also offers cases of them pulling back from the brink. Strong democratic institutions can withstand tremendous strain if leaders and citizens actively reinforce them. Take Spain in the 2010s. It faced a potent mix of economic crisis, one of Europe's highest inequality rates, surging regional nationalism in Catalonia, and a fragmented parliament with bitter polarization. Those are ingredients that have led to civil strife elsewhere. Yet Spain so far has avoided a new civil war. One reason is the resilience of its institutions. Courts and electoral mechanisms, while not perfect, have contained disputes like Catalonia's independence push within a legal framework. And importantly, major Spanish political players on both the left and the right have, at least for now, rejected violence and marginalized those who advocate for it. And the key here in all these cases is that enough of the people in power choose institutions and negotiation over absolutism. These examples all underline an encouraging truth. No society is fated to tear itself apart. The spiral towards civil war can be halted at many points, but doing so requires recognizing the pattern early and acting decisively. What actions make a difference? Well, experts emphasize a few. Bolstering democratic institutions so that courts and elections are trusted to handle disputes. Fostering cross-cutting identities so that people see each other as compatriots in some shared identity rather than only enemies across one divide. Think America First, for example. And enforcing consistent justice so that political violence never gets winked at, no matter who commits it. For instance, ensuring that members of law enforcement and the military remain professional and impartial is vital. A last line of defense against civil war is when security forces, or police, refuse to obey illegal orders or turn on civilians. If they uphold the rule of law, even a demagogue's attempts to ignite violence can be stymied. Conversely, if police or military factions take sides in a partisan clash, the slide to civil war accelerates. In fact, I might even say that the most important thing is to watch what law enforcement does when instructed to do bad things. As of 2025, the United States, like several other democracies, finds itself in a moment of decision. All the classic preconditions for internal conflict are in fact present. Partial democracy, factionalized parties, a once dominant majority anxious about its future. Then there's the rising acceptance, and in some cases, the disgusting celebration of political violence and weakening institutional bulwarks. These are the rhymes of history that we've seen before, from ancient Rome's republic to the fractured Balkans. But nothing is preordained. The future pivot depends on choices made in the present. Will leaders put long-term stability above short-term wins? And rein in the rhetoric of hate? Will ordinary citizens reject the urge to demonize their neighbors and instead rebuild some basic trust? History suggests that societies which avoid civil war aren't those with zero divisions or grievances. Those don't exist, but those that find ways to avert the worst outcomes through flexibility, dialogue, and restraint, even at the 11th hour. It's often said that history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. We know the verses that led into a civil war. Strident factionalism, loss of faith in democracy, violence deemed tolerable and then routine. The United States has heard these refrains before in the 1850s, the 1960s, and they pulled back from an abyss at least once. The question now is whether enough Americans, recognizing their familiar tune, can change the music before the crescendo. Around the world, people in other polarized nations are watching, facing their own version of this test. In the end, avoiding civil war may come down to something very simple and very human. Remembering that no matter our differences, the cost of letting hatred take over is one we all will bear. It's a lesson every civil war has taught, and one we still have the chance to heed before it's too late. And, by the way, if you want to know what always happens before a superpower falls, well, this has a lot to do with it. And you can see more if you check out this video.